Thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of the Natural State Podcast. I am Anthony Gustin, and today I have Eric Perner on the show, who is the founder of Rep Provisions, a regenerative ranch in Oklahoma, who is doing some really fascinating things on their spot. But we dig into a lot of things here. As you guys know, regenerative ag is one of my favorite topics, and I think a required thing to fix our food system to make healthy humans, healthy animals, and a healthy planet. So in this episode, we talk about the difference that Eric had between grass-fed and regenerative, a lot about all the problems that we see facing it, and then how you can incorporate other species to speed things up and get ecosystems back to their natural state. So tune into this one and hope you guys enjoy. Eric, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, you guys at Rep Provisions are one of among a bunch of other awesome producers here in the regenerative space, but happy to get you on and talk about regenerative principles, sort of the state of affairs currently in regen, as I'd like to abbreviate to, because I think that regenerative agriculture is just too much of a mouthful. So I'm trying to find better marketing terms for it to help it with its adoption. But yeah, just curious if we get started with chatting about how you got into this stuff. You're a lifelong farmer and rancher. When did you get involved, and your fascination with the whole industry?
Yeah, so I grew up on a small cattle farm, and I kind of grew up with a dad who was kind of regenerative before that was even a buzzword. So he explained to me how important it is that you manage your grasslands and how you use your cattle to do that. So I kind of had this early foundation of what was not known as regenerative back then, but just basically kind of working within nature's confines. And so
how did your dad know to do that? Just like my grandparents, probably his age, went the very commercial route. My family, back 7 generations, as far as we can trace, have all been farmers. And my parents, when they were on the farms growing up, it was switched to commercial dairy and just huge monocrop fields, which it were. So I'm just curious how he had that intuition. Where did he learn from? Like what were there seems to be a fork in the road here about, 30, 40, 50 years ago that some people took and some people didn't. So I was just curious if you have any intel on that.
Yeah, he loved nature. He loved, wildlife. He loved our native perennial grasses. So those were things he wanted to flourish on our ranch. And he wasn't he was a cattleman, but this was more of a hobby for him. It wasn't how he made his living by any means. So it was more, he wanted to do those things, and he knew animals played a critical part in that, and how you manage them played a critical part. So I was basically early on, I was kind of forced to learn every native perennial grass on our property, know its importance, what habitat it provided, and how we graze the cattle can actually kind of make a difference in that. On top of that, I think he saw, like a lot of people were seeing in the conventional way, that it's just hard to make a living too. And, we saw a lot of land around us degrade over time, and he was kind of aware of this from the get-go. And so it just kind of stuck with me. And the regenerative piece never really got any traction until, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago, the grass-fed beef really started to catch on. And so when I bought my own ranch, I was determined, to do things differently and get where I could actually make a living at it. And grass-fed began to be, really catch on with the health and wellness community. So that's what I did for when I started the ranch on my own, and began to market that to our local Tulsa community. And that did really well. And then regenerative started to take off. And that's when I kind of knew, hey, this gets me back to my roots, basically. And now we have an audience that's interested in it, and that I can maybe market a product around it. And that's when our CPG Rep Provisions took off.
Got it.
And we have that.
So I'm curious to hear your definition of regenerative versus grass-fed, because I think that, again, the naming of regenerative agriculture too long, branding problem. I think another branding problem that's preventing it from taking off is the lack of agreement or understanding around what this term actually means. I mean, you have a lot of different definitions, whether the input-based or outcome-based. I'm just curious in sort of your thought and how you separate grass-fed from either how you were doing it, or from regenerative, or from just like a standard definition that you think.
Yeah. And that's a great question, because regenerative, depending on who you ask, you get different answers. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of a little background. And I think when we think of agriculture, I can put it in about three different buckets, right? So our conventional agriculture, like you mentioned on monocropping, which is highly extractive, right? So they're taking more than they're putting back all the time. That's just the nature of that beast. So that's one term. And then we have sustainable agriculture, which is probably an improvement over conventional, but it's still a sustaining an already degraded system. And then regenerative, which in its core principle, it's basically building soil over time. And there's so many critical components if we build soil over time. And I just want to point out, nature left to its own vices was always regenerative. It was always, that's why we have, 3 foot plus of topsoil in the Great Plains. It's because that's nature's way. And so it's kind of getting back to those set of ecological principles that allow us to manage land. And, now it's kind of evolved into this space where, monocrop people can be regenerative if they do certain things, and how we manage cattle can be regenerative. So it's really gotten back to this cycle, this human construct that we developed called regenerative. But at its core principle, it's practices that build soil over time. And the best way to do that is mimicking natural processes. And I think, if you're building soil over time, you're regenerating root structures of plants. If you're regenerating root structures of plants, you're regenerating soil microbes and fungi and things like that. And then if you're regenerating soil microbes and fungi, then you're regenerating mineral and water cycles. And then all these things, if you're regenerating those things, you're regenerating the carbon cycle, which affects the atmosphere. And if you're doing that, you're regenerating ecosystems, which benefits all plants and animals. And so there's this compounding cycle regenerative that's super exciting. But I agree with you, it's really hard to describe in one succinct definition. And so it takes a little bit of education on the consumer's part.
Right. And so when you were doing grass-fed and then you said you switched to more regenerative stuff, how did that look different for you?
Well, for me, it didn't. It looked a little bit different in the sense that, I became a part of the Savory Institute, which is Alan Savory. This is a 501c3 organization out of Boulder that really kind of coined the term for holistic management of animals. And that piece of how you manage animals really becomes regenerative. And so while I was already practicing certain skill sets to be quote unquote regenerative, being part of that organization really helped me improve upon those skills. And so that's just learning how to time your grazing, right? So how much animal impact you need at certain times of the year and when to move those animals. And so it's really mimicking those natural, herds of bison that roam the Great Plains that develop these deep soils that we have today.
Yeah. So, I think this is one of the biggest open things that people don't understand. What is the difference between regenerative and grass-fed? And I think that, even driving around Texas all the time, I see all of these places that just do free grazing, unlimited, and the soil looks like trash and there's mesquite growing everywhere. And there's just not a balanced ecosystem. You can just tell by looking at it. And so you can have technical grass-fed by just putting cattle out or bison or whatever out in an open field and having them do whatever they want. So there's a huge difference when, and I'd love to get into the details of how you guys operate and how you think about this and how, if you've deviated at all from the holistic management protocols or anything like that. But again, the bison would have roamed around in tight packs and had the predator pressure that would have moved them around. So they would have eaten a little bit and then moved on. When you have it in an open grazing protocol, we don't have to do any sort of, AMP or mob grazing or this type of stuff and moving the cattle around. They eat whatever they want and they don't eat the other stuff that they don't want, and they overeat, and there's just a huge imbalance. And so you need this rest recovery cycle that, again, wolves or bobcats or whatever would have chased these animals off the land so that the soil, grasses on the soil could regenerate in time. Like you said, further deepening that root structure and further improving the life cycle of the entire ecosystem. So as far as like when you guys first got started with this, was it a huge change, or you just, how many acres do you have? How are you grazing it before? Like what were the first implements you guys sort of went down?
Yeah. So initially, so right now our current farm is 360 acres, and we had about 6 paddocks that we rotated through. And so we're talking 150 head of cattle that we rotated through 6 paddocks.
When you were doing just grass fed, or was that
just grass fed? Yeah. And that worked pretty well. I mean, when I bought the land in 2006, it went from really degraded to within a matter of 5 or 6 years doing really well. A lot of the native warm season perennials were coming back. A lot of the native forbs were coming back. So I was making headway, right, with those 6 paddocks of rotating through and just, properly timing that grazing, not leaving them there too long, just like you said, not letting them overgraze some parts and undergraze others. So that was a help. But then when I got aligned with Savory and I realized how, it really made that connection between herd effect and timing your grazing, we doubled those 6 paddocks to 12. And so now we went from 6 to 12. Well, things progressively got better and we added a few more animals in the process. And then within these, and now today with those 12 paddocks, we're also rotating within each 12 paddock small 1 acre sections with mobile electric fence. And so we're really seeing the effects and improvements of that. And we've yet to even come close to tap out on the amount of animals that we can manage. And so we're going to increase that herd size again this year. We've got multi-species now. So we've got, hogs that are roaming the forested areas and goats helping us make that animal impact as well as the browsers. So we've got a better functioning ecosystem than I've ever seen it. But I've still yet to reach the capability of this land base yet.
Yeah. And I think that this is another misconception around just agriculture in general I think about this space and like why I got here is because it starts to answer a lot of the questions that I've had about health, the planet, all of these type of things. And I think that still a big open question that's remained to be solved is, are we going to be able to have enough food to feed people in the world? No matter how you look at it, there's going to be more food availability if you do land management this way. The carrying capacity of land skyrockets when you manage it in an appropriate way. And like you're saying, like you're building your herd, it's increasing. You don't even know what the top end is, but so you started with 150 when you started your herd with the grass fed. What is or is that what you have now?
No, that's what we have now. We started with about 80 head when we were just doing grass fed. So when we doubled paddocks, we almost doubled our herd size.
And you're still not even at the point where.
And I'm not even close. Yeah. I mean, I have so much grass, like it's over my head in spots just from the spring growth. And yeah, it's like we're not even close to tapping out yet.
Right. So
that's super exciting.
Right. Which is crazy to think that. Most people think that beef is an unsustainable extractive thing, but actually when you manage it better, you can produce far more food. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate. Also I'm sure you could mention inputs. I don't know if your inputs have changed with anything you had to supplement with when you first started with grass-fed, and like the importance of just inputs that most people don't realize how expensive they are and how detrimental they can be to the ecosystem, or at least preventing it from regenerating. So I don't know what your inputs are, what they've changed over the time.
Yeah. So some of the, like, for example, the only inputs we had, like we practiced basically all organic practices. So we have almost no inputs to begin with. So we don't worm our cattle ever. That's an input that most cattlemen do. We don't, we give no type of antibiotics or no vaccines or anything of that nature, which most cattlemen are forced to do or think they have to do. And typically, that comes from about where not managing your herd, you have to do some of these inputs. Some of the other inputs that I can think of is that we would have to feed hay all winter. And, when in the dormant season comes around and you have to feed hay, that's a huge, massive input. And we've gotten our hay bill cut down 2/3. So basically, when we graze this way, we stockpile so much extra grass that through the winter, we're able to take advantage of that grass. So I think here in Oklahoma, where I'm at, it gets cold enough that usually by October, guys are feeding hay all the way up till March again. Mm-hmm. And this last year, we only fed hay from December, the end of December to January, February. So a little over 2 months. So we've cut that timing in half on hay inputs. Other than that, there's just really no other inputs Some guys, they feed tons of grain. Those are huge inputs. They're, perhaps giving some sort of steroid for extra growth, but none of that we practice here. And yet we're still generating more pounds per acre than we were previously, or any of my neighbors are.
Right. And so what about mineral content? Have you guys observed that or done any sort of testing there? And what have you done to kickstart that cycle?
Yeah, so we have not done any testing to answer your question, but we do offer some free choice mineral for our cows. So just salt, basically, something to supplement that. I do think that, I definitely think with our mineral cycle really functioning, that our plants are higher nutrient dense plants and there's less inputs on that. But as far as salt, things of that nature, that are typically kind of important components for beef, we do offer some of that still continues today.
Yeah. Has that decreased at all?
We've held it about same. But I'd like to answer your question. I don't really have any studies to say that I should be feeding it or that I shouldn't. It's kind of one of those things that, well, they're probably not getting enough salt and enough mineral. If you think back when animals were free to roam, they could find these areas of the country where they could lick minerals from certain areas and then move on. But now that we put fencing up everywhere, I can't be confident they're getting those specific mineral requirements that are necessary.
Yeah. And what have, I think, just been naturally occurring in the ecosystem as well. And I mean, the mineral depletion of our soils has been pretty profound over the last 100+ years. But I'm just always curious on that, how people are integrating that. I know that Redmond Salt does some stuff where, they have bentonite clay and the salt from their mines that you can spread over fields. Just curious if you've done anything like that. But
no, we've not done anything like that. But honestly, I can't, we have so much grass now, it's hard to process. So there would be no really net benefit for me to apply anything to my soil.
Right. Got it. Very interesting. So I'd like to move a little bit towards, you said that, you're starting to add in pigs, you're starting to add in goats. Do you have broilers or layers, or what does the speciation look like on your property?
So right now it's cattle. The majority is cattle. We have hogs that we graze. On this property, we have a lot of forested areas, and a lot of the forested areas were just overgrown. So, if you think back, when before man got involved, animals really cleared a lot of that forest out. So they kept that underbrush clean. They let light touch the forest floor, and it grew more grass. So over the years, once we suppressed fire and we've suppressed all the browsers, well, this turned into just a mess. And there were parts of probably 100 acres on this property that were just not accessible by anything. And so what we've done is we've used the hogs to come in and clear out a lot of those root structures of that viney kind of small trees and things. They kind of tear that up. And then we follow that with a herd of goats, which then, get the final piece. And this has really opened up that canopy. So now it's a more, healthy functioning ecosystem. And just for our part of the country, we're in the cross timbers ecoregion. And the cross timbers is really where the more heavily wooded eastern part of the country transitions to the tall grass prairie. And so it was more of a savanna-like ecosystem. But what we have is just some grassland and then really thick, dense trees that have not had any impact for literally decades and decades and decades. So these pigs, followed by the goats, are creating that impact to really open that forest canopy. And now this is the first year where I've had it full time. I'm seeing tremendous growth, different grasses that have sat there dormant for decades that are now starting to come up. So that's another piece of how you use animals. And not only that, the other piece that you could do, a farmer could look at that, well, I want to open up that canopy. Yeah, but I'm going to use, heavy equipment to get it done really quickly. Well, why do that? That's a resource. I can use that and graze it with my hogs and with goats and then sell that. That's protein that's plants that you can convert to protein and make a living off of it. So I think this is kind of a silly way is to, either burn all of it or use heavy machinery, burn a ton of fuel, spend a lot of money, when that's this resource that we can use, that we can tap into if you know how.
My fiance and I just got a small farm here outside of Austin recently, and I like to call all of our shrubs, grasses, everything potential meat.
It is. It's exactly.
And that's how I think about it. And so it's curious how Are you clearing little areas? So I'm imagining you're using electric fencing to keep the hogs and the goats where they are.
We do for the hogs. We have electric fencing, so we focus them in the areas we want impact. And then the goats basically kind of follow the hogs. They have open areas and they kind of free range after that. So it kind of limits that labor. And goats are tricky. They're not as kind to deal with on fencing of any kind, but they follow perfectly behind the hogs. They don't get in with the hogs, but they follow behind them and nibbling off all that extra tender woody species. They're browsers by nature. So they're just doing what comes natural to them, but no fencing for them, but the hogs do get focused with electric fencing.
Got it. Are you giving the hogs any supplemental feed?
Yes. So, here's the unfortunate part with hogs or poultry. It's really difficult to get any kind of enough gain on pasture alone. And so we do supplement with some fermented grain from our local brewery that they get daily. But it's really a challenge, and I know you know this with poultry and hogs to do it with just free range completely. I like to get there someday, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those open questions for me, is that with ruminant animals, it's very clear that these are regenerative by nature and can be very easily. But when it comes to the term regenerative pork or chicken, I'm kind of questioning whether that's like a truly regenerative system, especially when looking at the feed supply chains. And then I think that what you're doing using fermented grain byproducts, that's going to be food waste anyways. Great. But when people are feeding chickens and pigs GMO corn and soy, but they're moving them around in mobile range coops or whatever, yes, the impact on the land probably would be great, but you used to look at the supply chain and say, okay, how far is this stuff being trucked away from? Like, what is the impact of the actual feed supply chain? Is the corn and soy being fed to the chickens that are moving around? Is that an extractive system? And then is it even getting back to a sustainable system, or is that like net negative on the entire ecosystem? So yeah, these things are sort of top of mind for me for sure. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Number one, we do anything if they do we do some poultry operations on our partner farm, and it's all non-GMO. We're trying to get completely away from corn and soy. And that's our next iteration to get to that point. And I do understand where you're coming from. But like I said, the term regenerative comes from, if you're building soil over time. We know we're doing that here. And we know we can do that with animals. Now, if that corn or soy or grain or whatever is coming from a highly extractive farm somewhere, a monocrop system, that's a valid case. But I think even with monocrops now, there's ways to mix in different species throughout the year to graze animals on those monocrop that could become regenerative. So I agree with you that there needs to be what we would love to have is a regenerative grain source for hogs and poultry, I think, at the end of the day. And so that we know these have been a mix of different cover crops throughout the year, and they also have a mix of animal species grazing on those regenerative grain. We're not there yet, Anthony, but I think we will get there one day, but it's not there yet for sure.
Yeah. What breed are you using? Mangalitsa?
Yeah. Mangalitsa right now. Yeah.
Got it. Interesting. And how long does it take them to clear an area? Like, what's the density? What size are you doing?
They can clear about 2 acres in about 2 months. So they completely just cleared out. And I mean, they go in, they dig up those roots, and that's what they eat. We've got lots of pecan and of different of species of trees that have nuts on them. So they dig that up and they dig up all the poison ivy roots. So all these root growing type systems, they dig up and eat that. And so when they do, they leave, basically a somewhat cultivated field, but they've also kind of put their dung and their urine on that. And then we move them on. That comes back really significantly. So that's a one other thing I want to point out. You can impact soil this way and get a net benefit. So it's not always bad. So it's when you continually plow every year after year after year, you kill all that life. But these animals, they kind of do their job. It's almost like tilling, so to speak. But when you leave it alone, it's dug up so many different seeds that have been in that earth for so long that they regenerate very quickly.
Right. Especially when there's invasives. Like we have a lot of yopon here, cedar that grow in between all the oaks. And this is exactly what I was going to do. Actually, is kind of what you're talking about. So I'm asking so many detailed questions here.
Yeah.
My own little research, but yeah, I mean, this is the question I have. It's like, is supplemental feed required? Like, how long does it take? And then I guess a follow-up question would be, after you guys clear out all of your wooded area and it's growing nicely, there's a good understory. Are you going to continue to run the hogs there, or what's the plan with that?
Typically, probably what would happen if there's enough grass, depending on where we're at, we could cycle in cattle at some point in time, and then again, bring hogs back at a later date. So we see this entire system where all animals are benefiting. So in our pecan orchards, we're running cattle in those now. So it's kind of more like a solo pasture type, and they do a great job. They eat the grass, they fertilize the pecan crops, and they do a really good job there. But we see a full cycle of all animals providing their impact at the right time. So yeah, we do see hogs coming back through there, but there's going to be even more for them to eat. So the hogs will graze grass as well. So there'll just be more volume there than there is now.
Are you going to do anything to prevent rooting after you have them more on pasture?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. So what we'll have to do is, once we get that recovered and regenerated with good grass, then we'll have to cycle the hogs through much quicker. But right now we needed heavy impact. Like we needed, to literally, root everything up. So not until we're seeing a lot of soil, bare soil, basically, until we get off of there. And then that allows that to really kill a lot of those woody species, those viney species. So when we actually know they did that full job, that's when we move them. But then it takes a little longer recovery at that time.
And you said the goats go right behind and are not contained?
They are not contained. So they're free. They're interesting because they always stick together. That's their protection. So you've got the older goats with the kids, and then the big ram that runs with them. So that's their protection. So they naturally kind of herd themselves, but they'll follow right behind them very closely and clean up all the stuff that they miss. So all those, woody species that still have leaves on them, they'll go in and tear those up and eat the bark off the little trees that then knock that back and allow more grass. So it's a cool cycle. But
yeah, do you also supplement the goats?
They get almost nothing. The only thing we might do for the goats is add some grain to focus them in an area where we want them to stay a little bit longer. But that would be the only time. They're fully, I would say 99% is just all browsing.
Very interesting.
But there are times when we use an attractant of a grain to get them to stay somewhere a little bit longer. That's it.
Do you have a guard dog or anything like that to keep everything?
No, and we have not. We haven't lost one animal yet, surprisingly. And it's interesting because we have coyote, we've got mountain lion, but we've not. I'm not saying we won't one day, but we have yet to lose one animal.
Interesting. Yeah, that is fascinating. So, do you have the goats retained in some sort of like perimeter fence, or how?
Well, yeah. So we have the outer fence of the property, which has, basically 5 strands of barbed wire. That's not going to stop a goat, but once they learn their area, they just don't leave it. They stay pretty close.
Got it.
So, yeah.
Cool. And then you said you have chickens as well?
We have a partner farm we've baselined her property, and she's kind of in our system of knowing she's doing things right. She kind of, and she does poultry for us. So our supply chain is made up of 5 different family ranches, all located here in Northeast Oklahoma. Our biggest goal, Anthony, was to create a system where farmers could get a fair price for their product they're growing, because this is a huge problem. I mean, farmers are getting literally crushed at the livestock yard. And if you're doing things right and you're stepping up and say, hey, I'm going to do things differently, I think there ought to be, value in that. And so the company is creating that value, offering them a better price for their beef or their chicken in this case. And, because everything under our standards, we know they're doing the right thing. We know they're managing land in a regenerative way. And we want those farmers to get rewarded for that. And if we could do that, that's how you scale this, right? I mean, I'm always thinking about, how do we scale regenerative? Because I think we talked earlier, it's not moving fast enough. I mean, at this rate, it's going to take 100 years. But by doing that, offering these farmers a good price where they can make a living again is one step in the right direction.
What are some of the reasons why you think it's tough to scale right now? I mean, I have a bunch of thoughts on this. This is like my major question that I ask. I'm curious in your thoughts and some of the solutions maybe.
I think number one, older farmers are less likely to change. That's just number one. It's the whole kind of thing. I've been doing this way my whole life, and they're just less receptive to change, right? Number two is, if I go in to a farmer and tell him, hey, I want you to take your cattle and move them every day with electric fencing, he's probably going to laugh at me. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're seeing way more work, I think. In reality, it's not that bad, but that's what they see when they hear that. But the flip side to that, Anthony, is that just if you start with 1,000 acres, right, and you're running 100, let's say 100 head on that 1,000 acres because you think that's all you can do. If you just cut that in half, that's better than what you started with, and rotating your herd back and forth. At least that's something. That's a trend in the right direction. And perhaps you can run more animals that way. So when you can start a conversation like that, like, hey, you don't have to go out like I'm doing and moving them every single day, but let's just cut your paddocks in half. That's easy. I mean, we can run a temporary electric fence down one side of your property, cut it in half, and that's better than what you were doing. So you start the conversation that way. And then when they begin to see the effects of it and the compounding effects of, oh, I can have more animals. Now I'm generating more revenue. Now I have an outlet like a rep that I can sell to for a fair price. Then it starts to make that conversation much, much easier.
Yeah. I mean, this is like, I'm a big fan of Greg Judy and the stuff he does as well. And I mean, he's talking about this stuff. It's like, yeah, anything in the right direction is better, but that's why it's so confusing. Like, when does it cross thresholds from, like you said before, you had 6 packs and now it's 12, way different. Like, that was grass fed, now regenerative. And so it's just, there's so much nuance here and so much, I think, confusion, even with people who are trying to learn this stuff and all the details behind it. I mean, I think that it's another huge one is talking about all these old farmers not wanting to change. There's also a lot of old farmers who are retiring or dying that have a lot of land, and no generation wants to come behind them and do anything with it. What they want to do is parcel it off and sell it to people who want land for recreation. And I've even seen that in the last 2 years here around Austin has been insane. And the amount of people from this city, the COVID accelerated everybody's migration. People from larger cities are moving here, and people from Austin are now moving out to some sort of neighboring rural area, which I think is great for people to be back in rural areas. But now you're getting people who buy 50, 100, 500 acres just for recreation and leisure that used to be farmland, and now are just letting sit there. And so the also in the last year, 2 years, price of land has absolutely skyrocketed. So you have the availability of land decreasing, the size of land decreasing into smaller parcels, and the price of it increasing rapidly. And the amount of knowledge from people, like, I mean, you growing up with all of this history, being able to go back is, you have quite a leg up. But somebody with their 25, 30, 35, 40 wanting to buy land to do this type of work, it's so incredibly inaccessible. So, I mean, this is what I think is one of the most major things in the way of regenerative ag. And so I don't know if it looks like some sort of solution being a large land lease operation where you can show people that, hey, like, we can come on your land and use these animals and make your land more beautiful and more attractive to wildlife and more valuable over a long period of time. Because look, we'll restore the soil and make it much healthier of an ecosystem. So ag valuations, all this type of stuff, I think that there can be some operation there. But I think, yeah, the amount of people moving into land who have no intention of using it for food production is one of by far the biggest problems transitioning the country to this type of model.
Yeah, I hear you. And I mean, even here, you're right. They're building homes. What's truly sad is they're taking some of the most productive farmland in the nation and covering it with concrete. I mean, this is stupid. This is dumb. We should not be doing this. We're gonna wish we didn't do that one day. And yeah, I hear you. Land's incredibly expensive. We just had, just recently, within the past month, there's around almost 1,000 acres that opened up right around me that is for sale. And we're desperately trying to figure out a way to finance that somehow. And it's so expensive, though, it seems almost impossible. But it's some of the richest farmland in the country. And it would be just a shame that somebody took it and just used it for a hobby ranch and just let it degrade, or, put, several hundred head of cattle and degrade it, or do whatever, not manage it properly, like you mentioned, and watch it degrade over time. So yeah, it's a huge issue. I think it's companies like Rep and maybe an Epic or somebody who's rewarding folks that do it right and giving them a fair price for their product is one step. So I think companies like Rep rewarding people doing it right is the first step and showing them how to do it. And we're training folks on this ranch as well. And that they're seeing that there's some big returns there. I think that's inspiring to younger people. Now, how they get the money to do it, I have no idea. But the other piece to that, I think, the answer could lie somewhere in ecosystem service credits market. So, we've got huge issues, facing humanity on years forward, and we know we've got to do something about it. There's a lot of folks out there that think that, rewarding farmers, to switch to these better methods and actually paying them on, perhaps it's on the amount of carbon they store or the amount of biomass that they grow or whatever it is, whatever that metric, if we can define that, if the scientific community can come together and define what that is, and farmers see a payment structure through that, that could be an impetus for change as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful. There's a lot of things out there, a lot of things talked about, nothing, that's concrete yet, but I'm hopeful there's going to be a big shift change in the near future.
Yeah, we're going to need to do something. And I think like the shift towards vertical indoor farms and lab grown meat or just fake plant-based meat is not the answer. We talk about extractive model. I mean, look up, fill in the blank headquarters, Oatly, Impossible, Beyond, any large fact. Like this is a factory that pumps out greenhouse gases by definition, that needs to have inputs trucked in all the time. Inputs don't come for free. This is what I don't understand about this thing. I think that people just have such an abstraction and have grown up, were born, and all they know is a grocery store. Oh, the food is just here. This is where it is.
We're disconnected from our food for sure.
And not knowing that even if it's a plant-based burger, this has to be coming from somewhere. If it's an indoor vertical farm that's growing produce, the nutrients have to be coming from somewhere. It doesn't grow out of thin air. It's not how physics works. And so it's just to have full transparency. I think people are just not, I don't know if it's not educated enough, not motivated enough, not curious enough. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point when you talk about nutrients and that regenerative is, when I think about it in this way and how it benefits humanity, we're cycling nutrients in spots where it does humans, plants, and animals the most good, right? So we export a lot of nutrients, just like on these monocrop farms, right? So they're they have high inputs, and we export a lot of nutrients by not leaving that soil covered, and everything washing off in the river and down the Mississippi and end up in the ocean, right? So they've exported a ton of nutrients. It's not doing humanity any good at the bottom of that ocean, right? If we learn to cycle those nutrients in the place where they do us the most good, I think is a critical component of that.
Yeah.
And monocrops, I mean, gosh, when you think about, species extinction rates and what's happening there, monocrops are based on eradication, not regeneration. That's what they do. They eradicate everything except that one crop, right? And we're close to, I think it's like 500 million acres in the U.S. of monocrop farms. That's based on eradication. Nothing exists in those 500 million acres except that one crop. And I think this is having a devastating impact on ecosystems and species extinction, from insects to birds to everything. And I think that that's a huge risk if we go down this path of rewarding these companies that are promoting a plant-based system, because we know what in the day what it is. It's based on a monocrop system.
Right. So talking about nutrition and nutrients in general, have you guys done any testing in your cattle or your pork or chicken?
We are beginning. We're going to start testing the fat on our pork, because I think that there's a big there has been some testing previously that we haven't done, and we're going to follow the same protocol as a group that I've seen do this previously. And it really comes down to pork, just the fact, even though if you feed grain, if you're putting pork in their natural environment, that ratio, that omega-6, omega-3 ratio is dramatically lowered just by putting them on grass. When you raise them on concrete and feed them nothing but grain, it's through the roof. And I think with a big portion of our pork's diet grazing in open pasture or underneath woodlands, we'll see a big difference in that omega-6, omega-3 ratio compared to conventional pork.
Yeah, I would love to see that when you get the answer. I mean,
absolutely.
Are you talking about John Arbuckle's work with?
John Arbuckle, yeah.
So
Absolutely.
For people who don't know anything about what John did, he basically took comparison between pigs grown on concrete given free choice grain, or grown on pasture given free choice grain, or basically no grain, a little bit of milk powder to provide lysine for them to grow, as far as I understand it. And even if they eat all the grain they want, but they're on pasture instead of concrete, you completely reduce the amount of PUFAs, which is, to me, fascinating. I think that any way we can go down this direction, I don't think enough people are looking at farming from a perspective of how do we make this the most nutritious food possible. I think it's more of a how do we, it's people who are in it for a business typically, and they need to have turnover, they need to have margin, they need to survive as a business. And I totally understand that. So there's not a lot of incentive for farmers to look at nutrition, especially the fatty acid composition. I mean, we're still where 99.9% of people believe that saturated fat is the devil and omega-6 fatty acids are savior. And I think that anybody listens to anything that I do, they know that. I think that linoleic acid and polyunsaturated fatty acids are the primary cause of pretty much every chronic disease: obesity, diabetes, chronic health disease, all this stuff.
Yeah, and it's in everything.
Yeah, it's
in everything we eat. And it's because we created this monocropping system over the last 60 plus years that made it so incredibly cheap that food companies had to use it, right? And so it's what is cheap. And yeah, I mean, when you think about, the degrading health benefits of our body and the land and everything that comes from that system, it's tragic.
Yeah. And then because it's so cheap, then that's what we ended up feeding pigs and chickens to get them fat quick. And so then you're talking about pigs not being able to put weight on fast enough if you don't feed them. It's like we've created this arbitrary model where we're taking Cornish cross chicken breed and needing it to be ready to slaughter in 45 days, 48 days, whatever, when in the past it wasn't the case. And so anybody who wants to do it the right way and remove grains from monogastric animals input has no chance of making any money in this type of a model. It just doesn't, the economics do not work. You cannot compete with it. And yeah, I mean, basically like can we make healthy food that's regenerative, that can scale? Like that 3-part question is sort of like what's burning in the back of my mind. I think that you can have maybe 2 of those things at once, but to get all 3, it doesn't seem like there's an answer quite yet. And so I will keep investigating until we get to that point.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying. I mean, there are answers to this. And, think about it. We've put almost no money towards trying to figure it out.
Right.
Nothing. I mean, there's no, everything's gone towards conventional agriculture through the years. So no technology, no money to help us, very little science behind it. I mean, there's nothing dedicated to this, but I have no doubt when we put our mind to it, we can solve those 3 problems that you just mentioned. I have no doubt.
And I think a big part of it too comes back to consumer demands. So, I mean, organic was unfeasible 30 years ago. And now it's in every major supermarket. They have some section of it. And we talk about organic being bastardized in some ways, but when it comes down to it, it's better than conventional. That's just the way it is. And so,
agreed.
I mean, this is voting with your dollar is the most important thing you can do right now. This is why I have you on, if people want to go check out your stuff. I love what Force of Nature is doing, White Oak, et cetera. I mean, there's tons of amazing places that are doing this right now. Find a local farm, go out there and talk to them about this stuff. Ask them if they're doing that. And if you say, hey, here's what I'm looking for, and they're not doing it, and they have enough people asking for that thing, they will end up switching because they want to, again, it's a business. So tell them, hey, here's what I'm looking for. Keep finding your local farm, buy from you guys, and vote with your dollar so that way these practices can be expanded and the industry can grow. It's again, the number one thing we can do as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, the consumer has tremendous power. I mean, they can shift things on a dime quickly, and big industry will take note. It's even what's going on in oil and gas. I mean, you look at electric vehicles. The consumer said, "I want electric vehicles." Well, every single automaker is shifting that. The consumer said, "This is what we want," and I think you're right. I think the consumer could change everything very quickly, but you have to educate every one of those folks.
Yeah, which is the tough part, and why we have podcasts like this one. So
I know it's working, though. I promise it is working.
I can sense the shift is happening for sure, and I've been plugged into this for a couple of years, and I think it's really picking up steam. And I'm encouraged by a lot of large companies are getting on board. Nestle, General Mills, et cetera, are all committing a lot of money to changing over. Even some of the cereal grains to more regenerative models. I mean, these are forward-looking companies, and they understand that the life of their corporations depend on there being farmland to farm. And so, I think people, when they look at it from a practical standpoint, I mean, we need to do this transition. If we don't, it's not going to be pretty. We can't survive on factory farm foods forever.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's, we're estimated to be losing 75 billion tons of topsoil every year.
Oh,
that's not, we're clearly going out of business if we keep on the same path. And it doesn't matter, people talk about, I try not to be too hyperbolic, but, some scientists say, hey, we only have 10 years left to turn the tide. Some people, no, we got plenty of time to think about this and figure it out. What's it matter? I mean, if we're not, we know, we're carrying out a giant human experiment, and just saying, see what happens. No, we need to be doing something about it now.
Yes, we do. We should not wait. I mean, it's healthier for the planet, healthier for the animals, healthier for humans. Why would we do anything else? Higher carrying capacity, more meat produced per acre is just a very obvious thing to me. But still, we have Epicurious and some of these other places. This is Levin Park, I think, in New York, restaurants going all vegan, saying they're going to produce animal products. I mean, this is the fight we're fighting. And unfortunately, large fake food companies have higher margins, which they can reinvest into marketing. And meat is a commodity industry, and you can't have marketing when you're fighting for pennies. So it's going to be a battle. But thank you for being a huge part of it. Really appreciate everything you've done and coming on the show and sharing your expertise today.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Appreciate you getting the word out, Anthony. Appreciate you telling the story. Everything that you do is it fits right in with what we believe and the direction we need to go. But you and Paul Saladino, I mean, just amazing spokespersons for this movement. So I hope you never stop having that passion of sharing that. It's such important work. You're changing so many lives, the health of so many people, the health of the planet. Everything is really wrapped up and embodied in everything that you're trying to do.
Well, thanks, Eric. I'm honored to do the work. Really appreciate it. Where can people find everything that you guys are up to?
So if you just go to our website, that's repprovisions.com, repprovisions.com. So we keep a blog post on there. We've got all our products for sale, and get on our newsletter, and we can update you everything we're doing. We got some really exciting stuff happening over the summer that we'll be able to share later on, but looking really forward to a bright future And we need the help of that consumer is the main thing. They can shift change quicker than anyone.
Well, thanks again, Eric. Hopefully we'll see you later this summer. Talk to Brian about potentially going out there. So I don't know if you guys been.
Oh yeah, cool. Yet. I hope you make it. Yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, thanks again.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.